Good day. Today, 25th November, may just possibly come to be seen as an important day in the Ukraine war because it does seem that over the last 24, 36 hours, all kinds of things have been happening, all at the same time, all of which cumulatively point to a decisive point perhaps being reached. First of all, there's been a report in Bild-Zeitung, a German tabloid newspaper, about the United States and Germany having come together and decided to put pressure on Ukraine to begin negotiations with Russia by limiting the supply of weapons to Ukraine. The idea is that the Western powers will continue to supply Ukraine with just enough weapons to hold the front lines, but not enough for Ukraine to engage in any further offensives. And at the same time, the Western powers, the Germans and the Americans, are supposedly or allegedly putting pressure on the Ukrainians to begin negotiations in order to end the war. Now, the interesting fact about this article is that it has not been directly contradicted or refuted, at least not as of the time of making of this program, by either the US or German governments. And that is interesting. And it's also perhaps worth saying that Bild-Zeitung, though a tabloid, has historically, especially as I remember during the time when Angela Merkel was German Chancellor, but anyway, Bild-Zeitung does historically have access to good sources within the German government and German political leadership, and is sometimes used as a vehicle to communicate information from the German government. And this particular report claims to be sourced from German officials. Now, nothing in this conflict is ever straightforward, and I think that there's a few points that need to be made straight away. The way the article is drafted, one would think that there is in here, between Germany and the United States, some kind of plot, if you like, to force the Ukrainians into negotiations by denying them weapons. The reality is that the United States and Germany are very short of the weapons that Ukraine needs to conduct the war. Now, I'm getting lots of reports from lots of different sources. I'm not going to discuss these sources or disclose them, but some of them are very high level, one in particular, about the fact that NATO warehouses in Europe, in many places, in several countries, have now been stripped of some of their most vital weapon stocks. And it is the case that if you look at weapons deliveries, in Europe at least, Britain and France seem to have all but stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine, and the same, from what I can tell, is true of Italy as well, and this is consistent with reductions in weapon systems. Slovakia has said definitely that it will stop supplying further weapons to Ukraine. Some East European countries are reported to be converting old Soviet-era T-72 tanks. These are tanks taken out of warehouses, often not in particularly good condition apparently, refurbishing them, installing new engines and optical equipment and fire control computers, and sending them to the battle lines. But again, it's difficult to know the exact quantities, and my own sense is that the stockpile of T-72s in Europe has become now very run down. There was a report that I saw yesterday that the Leopard 1 tanks that Germany has been supplying are now starting to appear close to the battlefronts in the area near the town of Liman in northern Donetsk region. Now, I've discussed many times that the Leopard 1 is a tank which might have been effective in its day, but which was designed in the 1950s and which seems to have been overtaken by defense technologies and war conditions since then. Its armor is relatively thin. Its gun, 105mm rifled gun, is relatively light. It is not comparable to the modern Russian tanks that are now starting to proliferate on the battlefields. And one would feel that the Ukrainians would be nervous about deploying it to the battle lines in the way that they apparently are. In which case, perhaps the fact that the Leopard 2 is now apparently approaching the battle lines is a sign that the deliveries of T-72s, modernized, refurbished T-72s, are not perhaps proving as extensive as some said. So, fewer weapon systems from Europe. Germany does continue to provide weapon systems to Ukraine. It's supplied Ukraine with a further batch of, I believe, 25 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, for example. And it continues to supply Ukraine with surface-to-air missiles, Iris-T missiles, and Patriot missiles. But all of this is happening alongside reports that the German army itself is in a terrible condition, far from becoming stronger since the conflict began, despite Chancellor Scholz's statements that rebuilding Germany's defences would be the priority and that Germany was working towards recreating its armed forces. Far from anything like that happening, it seems that the reality is that the German army is continuing its increasingly rapid decline and decay into demoralization and obsolescence. So there is a limit to how many weapons the Europeans are able to supply. And the same is true in the United States. The United States has supplied Ukraine with huge numbers of weapons. It supplied Ukraine with large amounts of artillery, M777 howitzers. It supplied Ukraine with Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It supplied Ukraine with around 2 million 155mm shells. And of course, it's also supplied Ukraine with the 31 Abrams tanks, though so far we've not seen these on the battlefields. And they've been supplying Ukraine with HIMARS missiles and ATACMS missiles, and they're shortly going to help the Europeans supply the F-16s to Ukraine also. So the United States has been supplying weapons at a far greater rate than any European country has done, or indeed than the Europeans in aggregate have done. And as I understand it, production of shells, 155mm shells in Europe, is still around 4,000 shells a month, which is a day's use by Ukraine in this war. But the Americans have apparently increased shell production to around 28,000 shells a month, far from enough to meet either Ukrainian needs or those of the US military as a whole, but still more than what the Europeans are producing. The point is, and this is where we come back to my point about shells, the ability of the United States to continue to supply weapon systems to Ukraine at the levels that it did in 2022 and this year are now becoming exhausted. So whilst some weapons no doubt will continue to be supplied to Ukraine, it's perhaps a nice way for the Americans and the Germans to rationalize the fact that they're being obliged to supply less and less by pretending that this is all some kind of cunning plan to force the Ukrainians into negotiations. The reality, or so it seems to me, is completely different. It is the fact that the Americans, the Germans, the other European allies are unable to supply Ukraine with the quantities of weapons that it needs to conduct offensives. It is that reality which is forcing the American and German governments to tell Zelensky, to tell the Ukrainians that the time has come for them to begin some kind of negotiating process with the Russians. So this needs to be understood as what it is. It's not a plan. It's something that has been forced on the Germans and the Americans by the logistical and industrial realities that people like Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, Alex Vershinin at the Royal United Services Institute, myself, us at the Duran, and many others have been saying and talking about all along. Now, it makes for a nicer story. It doesn't confront European and American publics with the stark reality that the Western powers are out of weapons to send to Ukraine by pretending that the Ukrainians are not getting all the weapons that they need because the West wants to push Ukraine into negotiations. You don't want to admit to people in the United States especially, but I suspect to people in Europe as well, that you've been outproduced in weapons production by the Russians, a country which has been derided for many years as the gas station masquerading as a country, and which President Barack Obama once said doesn't produce anything. These memes have become so much part of the universal language, political language in the West. They have played such a huge role in shaping Western thinking about geopolitical affairs, that the Russians have broken, that they've got no industrial base to speak of, that their manufacturing and technology is primitive and not remotely at the level of the United States, that you can't just set these memes to one side and admit that they were wrong all along. Doing that opens you up, opens the American and German governments especially, and perhaps the British government up also, to questions about the quality of their intelligence, their understanding of what Russia really was about, and the whole nature of the decision-making process that brought us to this disastrous point in the first place. Now, it gets more interesting because even as this article in Bild Zeitung has appeared, the lead negotiator on the Ukrainian side in the negotiations with the Russians in February and March last year, David, I never get his name exactly right, David Aramahia, has now given an explosive interview for Ukrainian television. Now, those of you who have been listening to this channel and to the Duran, and who have been listening also to our interviews, especially with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, our discussions, our live streams with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, will already know the truth about those negotiations. We, in fact, on the Duran recently did a program about the latest German report about the negotiations, which has provided a timeline. It was put together by Michael Schulenberg, German diplomat who served for many years in the United Nations and who was a UN Deputy Secretary General of the UN, General Coup, former chief military officer in the German army, an important NATO official. I believe, in fact, he was the military chief or highest military ranking officer within NATO at one particular time. But anyway, that report has detailed and gone into exhaustive detail about those negotiations, the ones that took place in February and March of last year. And they have shown that the negotiations were indeed on the brink of success, that the Ukrainians and the Russians, when they got together, found that they could find common ground extremely fast, that the agreement, the original heads of proposal, were initialed by both sides. I've slightly gone a little beyond what this German report says, but I think that reading it and comparing it with what Russian officials and other people who are participating in those negotiations have also said, you can see that the Russian claim that the true reason why they withdrew their forces from around Kiev in March and April 2022 was because they genuinely believed that a deal was about to be signed and that the war, therefore, was about to end, and that they did do this at Ukraine's request and as a goodwill gesture in light of the progress in the negotiations. So, on the Duran, on this program, with Professor Sachs, we've talked about this. I've discussed at length, we've discussed at length, the outline negotiations, the outline of the agreement that had been agreed. We've discussed this, Glendison and I, with the ambassador of Belarus. We did an interview with him. The Belarus government played an important role in those negotiations. We've also discussed it with the British historian Jeff Roberts, who was tracking the negotiations closely, and Professor Nikolai Petro as well. I've just mentioned all of these things because what David Arahamia, if I'm getting his name correct, has said to us, to you, those of you who have been watching these programs regularly, well, there's nothing in this interview that he has given which is in any way new. He confirms that for the Russians, the big issue was Ukraine's prospective membership of NATO. The Ukrainians gave an undertaking over the course of the discussions that Ukraine would not join NATO, and the rest, all the other pieces, rapidly fell into place. And David Arahamia, if I'm getting his name right, has now essentially confirmed everything that we've been reading, everything that we've been saying on the Duran and in other places, and which appears in this German report, which is only, and this is not a coincidence, just come out. He confirms that the agreement was all but reached, that everybody, the Russians, the Ukrainians, were satisfied by the terms which had been agreed, that they protected the core interests of both sides, and that the negotiations were then wrecked at the insistence of the Western powers who sabotaged the negotiations and who prevented the agreement being concluded, and that, incidentally, the events in that northern suburb of Kiev, which came to light in April, the alleged events, maybe I should say, that took place in that northern suburb, that they had no bearing on this decision to stop the negotiations and to go back on Ukraine's side, to go back on the agreement which had been reached in Istanbul. Now, this is now being communicated to the Ukrainian people at a time when, as we will see shortly, the war is heading for Ukraine towards crisis. There's multiple defeats on the battlefronts. We will see that Ukrainian military units, Ukrainian military brigades, some of the best brigades in the Ukrainian army are now openly complaining about the leadership that they're receiving and about the orders that they're getting and about the way in which they've been thrown into battle. And there are growing economic problems as well. And of course, again, as we'll discuss further in the program, there's now growing evidence that President Zelensky is preparing to order a mass mobilization. And all of this, the Ukrainian people are being told by the lead negotiator, their country's own lead negotiator, that all of those months of fighting, more than a year of fighting since then, all those tens of thousands of men who died fighting on the Ukrainian side in places like Bakhmut, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Mariupol, in the summer offensive, in all of these places, that all of those lives could have been saved, that the devastation of Ukraine could have been avoided, that this new mobilization, this new round of mobilization that they're now facing could have been avoided also, had that agreement, which was reached last year, been implemented. Now that must be something which many people in Ukraine, I don't know how widely shown this interview has been, but this must be something which many people in Ukraine are going to be distressed and angry about if the full implications of it finally sink in, which I'm sure they will. And then there is another twist to this, and it's one that I have mentioned many times in the past, and it reflects upon my own country, Britain. because even though it is now clear from the German report that it was in fact the United States, President Biden and his officials, who were the ones who were most unhappy about the deal that the Ukrainians and the Russians had almost reached with each other, and that it was the United States that took the first steps to try to bring these negotiations to an early close, convening a NATO summit meeting on the 24th of March, which President Biden himself attended, in order to get the Europeans to agree to take a united position, setting conditions for the talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which they knew the Russians could not fulfill, and which were therefore intended to wreck the progress of the talks. Well, even though it was the United States, as I said, which ultimately didn't want this deal to go ahead, it was Britain, it was the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who acted as the US's enforcer. It was he who telephoned Zelensky and told him that the British were opposed to the agreement that Ukraine and Russia appeared to have reached with each other. It was Boris Johnson who then turned up unannounced in Kiev to insist to Zelensky that this deal could not go ahead. And of course, it was Boris Johnson that told the Ukrainians that if they pulled back on this deal, if they continued with the war, the Western powers would make sure that Ukraine was provided with all the weapons and equipment and material that it needed in order not just to push the Russians towards compromise, but to inflict a complete defeat upon them. And I have always said that the role Britain has been playing in this war opens up Britain to the role of scapegoat if one is needed, both in the West and in Ukraine, for what has gone wrong. And I noticed again that in this interview, David Arachmia, who, if I'm getting again his name wrong, by the way, apologies to him if I'm not. But anyway, this gentleman, the Ukrainian lead negotiator, when asked why Ukraine didn't proceed with this draft agreement that had been reached with the Russians, well, he put all the blame for it on Boris Johnson. He said it was the Boris Johnson who leaned on Zelensky, told Zelensky not to go ahead. He did so by telephone and by a personal visit, and that it was Boris Johnson, in other words, and by extension Britain, which wrecked the chance of peace and prevented the war from ending when it could have done. And one can see that the Ukrainians might want to blame Britain because, given their severe dependence on the United States, they probably don't want to put all the blame on the United States. And we can also see why the US itself, the Biden administration, might not be unhappy if all the blame for what is now starting to look increasingly like a debacle has to be put on Boris Johnson. I don't know whether anybody pointed it out to him at the time, but Boris Johnson going to Kiev, acting as the White House's messenger and enforcer, put him, and ultimately Britain, in a very exposed position, and the British government's overinvestment in supporting Ukraine and its clear-cut position, basically from the moment the fighting began, which is that it opposed negotiations. And by the way, its position even before then, which is that it didn't really even support the Minsk agreement, leaves Britain now in a position where if Ukraine goes down to defeat, is either totally defeated and overrun by the Russians and its existence as a state ends, or if it is forced into a severely disadvantageous peace by the Russians. Well, everybody, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Americans, they can all come together and agree on one thing, that it is the British who are to blame. Well, we'll see if that happens, but it seems to me that with this interview by Ukraine's lead negotiator, we got the first glimmer of that. Anyway, that's a sure sign, it seems to me, of what is going on behind the scenes, and it's clear that Zelensky himself is becoming increasingly nervous. Yesterday, he announced the sacking of, I understand, all the deputy ministers in the ministry that controls Ukraine's National Guard. Now, this is a internal control organization. It is one of the more ideological formations within the Ukrainian armed forces. Some months ago, Zelensky sacked its chief and replaced the chief of the National Guard with an officer who he appears to have thought would be more reliable and more loyal to himself. The deputies who have just been sacked are apparently people who this officer, who Zelensky himself appointed just a few months ago, appointed to their positions. It looks as if Zelensky is starting to doubt the reliability of the National Guard in a crisis. Apparently, he doesn't even trust the person he previously appointed. He's now sacked his deputies. He's appointing new people, apparently more loyal to himself, and it's quite plausible that he might be preparing to sack the minister himself, the very minister whom he appointed. And yesterday he gave a mumbling, rather unconvincing, and far from strong speech, in which he basically, however, confirmed that next week, this massive mobilization that we've been hearing so much about, the one that is going to call up young men, many of them teenagers, and perhaps women, that's apparently going to be launched next week. And we can, as I've discussed in many programs, the military leadership, from what I've been able to understand, has been demanding this mobilization. And so have the Western powers. And Zelensky, very nervously, is now coming round, finally, to ordering it. And you can see what's happening. Zelensky is being pushed into a position where Ukraine is supposed to go onto the defensive. It's now widely understood that further offensives by the Ukrainian military are impossible. The West is not in a position to supply sufficient weapons for an offensive like that to take place. The continuous offensives that Ukraine has been engaging in since the late summer of 2022, the ones in Kharkiv and Kherson region last year, and this enormous offensive that Ukraine launched and early this summer, and which in some places continues to flicker. All of this has caused the Ukrainian army to suffer enormous manpower losses, even though the Western media continues to pretend that Ukrainian losses have been far lower than Russian losses. The facts speak otherwise, and we're now getting more and more reports in the Western media about how Ukrainian units are severely under strength, how the men are exhausted and are at the end of their tether, how they desperately need reinforcement. So the idea is go onto the defensive. In the West, we hope that we can at least provide you with enough weapons so that you can hold your positions on the defense and fill up your brigades with teenagers and women, and hope that this is enough to keep the Russian juggernaut that's rumbling towards you at bay. And in the meantime, begin negotiations. Try to get a freeze. Buy yourself time. The wool was pulled over the Russians' eyes during the negotiations in March and April last year. The same thing was done way back in February 2015 with the Minsk Agreement. Perhaps, just possibly, you can pull off the same trick a third time, giving yourself more time and space so that at least we can get our difficult elections in 2024 in the West out of the way. It's not just the United States that's holding elections in 2024. They are happening in many countries, including Britain, by the way. But anyway, get all those elections out of the way, hold things together until then. And, well, we don't really know what we're going to do beyond that. We're floating all sorts of ideas about you joining NATO and you joining the EU, or us giving you security guarantees and things of that kind. But at least if you do these things, if you're able to rebuild your front lines with teenagers and women and whatever other manpower you can put together, well, that might be enough to stabilize the situation long enough so that we can get through our elections. And who knows, perhaps something then will turn up. Maybe there'll be a political crisis in Moscow. Maybe Putin will finally suffer one of these many mythical illnesses that he's supposed to be suffering from, and that will affect him. Maybe the oligarchs will finally turn on him. Maybe the Chinese will turn on him too. Who knows? We can keep our fingers crossed and hope that something will turn up. Now, Zelensky himself has been most unwilling to go down this route, and it's not just a case of him being delusional and messianic, as that Time magazine article discussed a few weeks ago. Though there is no doubt an element of that. It's that he is, after all, an elected politician, and he probably understands, and even if he doesn't understand, the people around him, people like Yermak, undoubtedly do understand how difficult this is going to be to sell to the Ukrainian public. So he's now got to persuade Ukrainians to agree to this further mobilization. He's got to get them to agree to an indefinite prolongation of the war, where only a few months ago they were being assured that victory was round the corner. And it's unsurprising that he's nervous that if he starts negotiations from a weaker position than the one he was in last year, with the Russians once more at his gates and with the country broken up and exhausted, well, there is a real possibility that people might begin to turn on him, that this new Maidan that he says that he's worried about, protest movement in Kiev, in other words, that might even happen. And it's not surprising, therefore, that he's taking steps to try to ensure the loyalty of Ukraine's internal security forces by sacking all the deputy ministers in the National Guard and replacing them by people he considers more reliable. I should say, I don't know myself what the real actual danger of a new Maidan is, but as we will see shortly, there are indeed signs now of growing unrest on the part of the soldiers, the actual soldiers on the front lines. And as we also know, as the blame game following the failure of the offensive, the summer offensive, has been escalating, relations between Zelensky and the military leadership, the general staff, Zaluzhny, Tarnavsky, all of those people, has also all but broken down. Now, I say all of this, but of course Zelensky himself, as he perhaps understands, has no very clear way forward, because he insists that ground must continue to be held. He's been rejecting all suggestions, apparently, that Adveyevka be abandoned, just as he previously rejected all proposals that Bakhmut be abandoned earlier this year. So he's digging in there. He wants offensives to continue. There have been more reports of more attacks in all sorts of places on the front lines by Ukrainians specifically, and most importantly in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. There's been lots of attacks going on there. And even though these attacks achieve nothing, he's very reluctant to acknowledge that the offensive in its totality was a failure. He insisted and got his attack on Gorlovka. Many people think that that attack was intended to persuade the Russians to divert troops from Bakhmut or Adveyevka. My own view, consistent with what we've been reading about Zelensky, is on the contrary, that he really did hope that a surprise attack on Gorlovka would actually result in its capture, enabling him to change the narrative about the direction of the war. And I suspect the same has been true to some extent about Ukrainian operations in Kherson region of the Dnieper River. So he insists that every millimetre of ground be defended, as he always has done. He insists that the offensive continue. He continues to insist that the war itself continue. And we've had an astonishing and really very deeply disturbing set of comments from Alexei Danilov, the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, which, in my opinion, is, in terms of military decision-making, almost certainly a more important body than the Defense Ministry itself. Anyway, Danilov, who strikes me as a strongly ideological figure, probably close to Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff. Anyway, Danilov basically acknowledged that the entire situation on the battlefronts is becoming grim. It's very difficult for Ukraine. He also admitted that in 2024, the situation was going to become grimmer still, that the Russians are building up their forces, that Ukraine's military is exhausted and run down, that the Western powers are not supplying the equipment and ammunition that Ukraine needs. But instead of providing some way out for Ukraine from this, he offered more of the same. He suggested that what the Ukrainians need to do is to endure all of this, to try to find some way of getting through 2024. He didn't explain why he thinks 2025 would in that case be any better. On current trends, it looks like it's going to get worse. He proposed what looked to me like war without end, with no prospect, however, of victory, with no route map, with no plan for how Ukraine would eventually achieve its victory against an adversary, Russia, who more and more people in Ukraine, we saw that with the interview that Hanna Maliar, the former Deputy Defense Minister, gave, which I discussed yesterday, which all increasing numbers of people in Ukraine now acknowledge is much more powerful. But that still seems to be Zelensky's position. He's been very reluctantly pushed towards a defensive strategy. He's been very reluctantly pushed towards a mobilization, which he clearly fears could trigger severe social tensions. And he's obviously unhappy about the prospect of re-entering negotiations with the Russians. He knows how deeply demoralizing that would be for the Ukrainian people after all the sacrifices and promises of victory that they've been given. And at the same time, Zelensky and Danilov and people like that have no real plan for how to win the war. All they can offer is victory without end. I remember that way back in 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who's always impressed me, has been one of the best military commentators in the United States, both about this war and about every other. He made the same point. He made the point that Ukraine has no rational route to victory in this war. That's been my feeling, by the way, right from the outset. Daniel Davis made that point, as I said, last year. And we now see starkly how true that is. The Ukrainians listened to the siren voices of people like Boris Johnson and people in the West. They thought they would get unlimited Western aid. They didn't perhaps look at contemporary history when they accepted those promises. They certainly grossly underestimated the Russians. I've been reading another interview with a Ukrainian officer who was on the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the armored force that participated in the Zaporozhye offensive. You can find long extracts of that interview on Simplicius the Thinker's blog on Substack. Anyway, this officer also confirms that the Ukrainians were expecting that when the attack in Zaporozhye was launched, the Russian defenses would crumble, that the Russian soldiers would flee. So the Ukrainians last year, and for much of this year, appear to have believed all that. But the reality always was exactly as Lieutenant Colonel Davis has said, that the Ukrainians have no route to victory. And we now see all of that presenting itself on the battlefields in ways that even the Ukrainian leadership can't deny. So, most probably over the next few days, maybe a week, we will get this announcement of this terrible mobilization. I do stress again, I think this is a terrible idea, this mobilization that Ukraine is about to launch. And we will probably see that this will happen with announcements that Ukraine, for the moment, is indeed transitioning to a defensive strategy. This will no doubt come with promises and assurances that Ukraine, as soon as it's reorganized and rebuilt its forces, will go on the attack again. I personally doubt that Zelensky is capable of beginning any kind of talks with the Russians. And it's become obvious to me that the Western powers have no real strategy for negotiations, and that all the ideas that they have of freezing the conflict, allowing the Russians to keep what they have, but making no bigger commitments than that, perhaps accepting that Ukraine might not join NATO, but treating it as a NATO member de facto if there is a freeze. And of course, some people like Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, still talk about Ukraine entering NATO, even if 20% of its territory is under Russian control. Anyway, there's no coherent or realistic Western negotiating strategy. There isn't one on the part of Ukraine either. There's hope of achieving a freeze, but we're going to see Ukraine go onto the defensive. We're going to see this enormous call-up of young people, very young people, and perhaps women. And all of this is going to happen as the Russian juggernaut starts cranking up and gaining in power. Now, this is perhaps the point where I go back to the discussions about what's been happening on the battlefields. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense has recently provided information about the state of the fighting. They haven't been doing this now for some time, but they have provided information about the quantities of weapons and equipment and men that Ukraine has been losing over the course of this war, over the course of the last week, I should say. And I think I'm right in saying that there has actually been a sudden uptick in casualties, that the Russian Ministry of Defense is now reporting a significant increase in Ukrainian casualties. Well, that may be, that may be true, but perhaps more importantly, we're now getting more evidence that the defences in Adveyevka, the most important place where the fighting is going on at the moment, that the defences in Adveyevka are now crumbling, and crumbling very fast. Now, there's been pictures that have appeared, photographs which have appeared, film that's appeared, of Russian tanks rolling through the ruins of various locations in and around Adveyevka. I understand that these are in the south, to the southeast of Adveyevka. There's pictures of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing for their lives from the advance of these Russian tanks. There's also reports that the Russian military is now escalating its attacks on the coke plant and the industrial zone in the north. It seems generally accepted that the Ukrainians have lost control in its entirety of the southern industrial zone in Adveyevka. And yesterday, there were also all sorts of reports that were pouring in about the Russians having gained control of yet another area called the wetlands. But I'm going to say straight away that I have no ability, no understanding exactly of where these wetlands, relative to the rest of Adveyevka, actually are, save that they appear to me to be somewhere to the southeast of Adveyevka itself, but within the overall defence positions. And there's also further news that the Russians have been advancing again to the north, west of the railway and northwards towards Ostoshenie, and that they're pushing the Ukrainians hard, and that the pincers are indeed closing. Well, all of that is very grim, and it points to a catastrophic picture in Adveyevka, and one that does actually increasingly make me wonder about how long the battle for Adveyevka can be sustained. But perhaps the most remarkable news, the thing that perhaps tells us most about the state of this battle, is that it appears that two of the military units, the Ukrainian military units that have been defending Adveyevka, are now openly quarrelling with each other. There's been another film produced by soldiers of the 110th Brigade, which is the brigade that is defending Adveyevka itself, that is located in Adveyevka itself. The soldiers, this same brigade, published a video about a week ago in which they complained bitterly about the fact that they'd been abandoned by their command staff and that they were being asked to try to recapture the slag heap, despite the fact that they were not getting the artillery and other support that they needed, and that many of their comrades, the bodies of many of their comrades were therefore littered on the, in and around the slag heap after senseless orders to attack the slag heap. For the record, I've heard no more reports of Ukrainian attacks on the slag heap since that video appeared. Anyway, in this latest video, the soldiers of the same brigade complain that they've been told by soldiers of the adjoining 53rd Brigade, which is defending the western flank of Adveyevka, somewhere to the west of where the 110th Brigade is itself located. Anyway, they complain that they've been told by the men of the 53rd Brigade that the 53rd Brigade is now under such intense pressure from the Russians. It is located in an area, by the way, which the Russian Air Force has been bombing heavily with precision-guided cluster munitions. Anyway, they've been told, the men of the 110th Brigade say, that they've been told by the men of the 53rd Brigade that the 53rd Brigade cannot hold its positions for much longer, that they're going to have to push and withdraw, in which case the 110th Brigade will be trapped. It will be in a cauldron. And the men of the 110th Brigade making this video complain bitterly about the 53rd Brigade. They say that the men of the 53rd Brigade are cowards. But in light of what the 53rd Brigade are saying, it's now questionable whether they can go on defending themselves. Now, I've never come across anything quite like this in any war. I know of no previous occasion in a war where two military units of the same army, in the face of the enemy, are arguing publicly with each other in this sort of way. And the common thread that unites these two units, the 53rd Brigade and the 110th Brigade, is that they both appear to be under all but intolerable pressure. Now, that suggests that the situation in Adveyevka is deteriorating very fast, and it does make one wonder how much longer resistance can be sustained there. In previous programs, I've suggested that the Russians might be able to capture Adveyevka by the end of the year. These latest statements by these Ukrainian brigades, the men of these Ukrainian brigades, they do make me wonder whether the collapse might actually come more quickly. I mean, I don't know that. That's just a possibility, it seems to me. But anyway, it does seem as if the situation in Adveyevka is becoming unbearable for the Ukrainian soldiers who are defending it. And it's not the only place where there has been unrest on the part of the soldiers who are fighting. Again, about a week ago, I think, I mentioned that a brigade, a Marine brigade, Ukrainian Marine brigade, which has been involved in the operation on the Dnieper River in Kherson region, has also published on its website a complaint about the enormous losses that it's suffering, the fact that it is being bombed by the Russians all the time, and it has complained angrily that there is a traitor somewhere that is disclosing its positions to the Russian Air Force. And another brigade in a completely different part of the front line, in a place called Belogorodka, I think I got the name correctly, which I understand is in Lugansk region, has now also come out and publicly published a video. And its men also are complaining that they've been put in an almost unbearable position. They say that they are defending this village, but they are denied artillery support. They have inadequate artillery support, inadequate military equipment to assist them. And again, one gets the sense that one of the factors that is causing them to be restive and unhappy is that they're now being regularly bombed by the Russian Air Force, also with cluster bombs. So, 4 brigades, a Marine brigade in Kherson region, 2 brigades in Adveyevka, 1 brigade in Lugansk region, or so I understand, all of them complaining now about the way in which the war is being conducted, about traitors in their midst, about illogical orders, about severe losses, about inadequate support. And in the case of the 110th Brigade, about the fact that they've been abandoned by their command staff, and in the case of the Marine Brigade, that there is no command staff to speak of in this village of Krinky, where they're holding out because the senior officers have never gone there. And one could see how the picture, therefore, looks grim. And I've discussed in this program the fact that it was the fighting in Adveyevka that is perhaps the most important, but it's not the only place where things have been happening on the battlefronts. There's been reports that the Russians are closing in on this village of Novomikhailovo. They apparently gained more ground around Novomikhailovo yesterday. I'm uncertain about the importance of this village, which is located somewhere to the south of Marinka. And there's been more reports of more Russian advances now in the Bakhmut area. They appear to be pushing hard to recapture the heights around Klashevka. And there's some reports that the Russians are pushing forward more purposefully in the north towards Bogdanovka. Well, we'll see. But the key point anyway is that the Ukrainians appear to be suffering increasingly heavy attrition. And coming back to the Russian Ministry of Defense, this is what it says about Ukrainian losses over the last week. It says that in the period from 18th to 24th of November, the Ukrainians lost 305 men, dead and wounded, in the Kupiansk area. They lost a further 740 men, killed and wounded, in the Liman area. In the Bakhmut area, they lost 1,680 men, killed and wounded. Still by far the heaviest losses that Ukraine is suffering continue to be lost in the Bakhmut area. In the southern Donetsk area, that is to say in the Vremivka salient, the Russians say that the Ukrainians lost 625 men, dead and wounded. In the Zaporozhye region, the area of Verbovoye, Rabotino, they lost 435 men, dead and wounded. Here, however, they also lost large numbers of armoured vehicles, 3 tanks, 21 armoured fighting vehicles. And in Kherson, in the area primarily of Krinky, they lost 405 men, dead and wounded. And here, by the way, they also lost 11 artillery guns and 12 boats. And the Russian Air Force continues to systematically destroy Ukraine's Air Force. Over the previous week, only one MiG-29 was shot down, probably because there are fewer of these left now. But yesterday, apparently 2 more were shot down. And incidentally, there's been reports that the Russians have now supplied more Sukhoi 57 and Sukhoi 35 aircraft and Sukhoi 34 aircraft to their Air Force, and that the MiG-35 light fighter is now also being deployed on the battlefronts. This is a very, very heavily modernized MiG-29 aircraft based on the MiG-29. It apparently has an ASAR radar, more advanced than that of the Sukhoi 35, for example, and it's starting to be deployed on the battlefronts also. So, very heavy losses by Ukraine, deteriorating military picture by Ukraine, Ukraine being forced against the wishes of its president to order what I think will be a catastrophic mobilization. Talk about going on the defensive, though it's not clear where. And in the meantime, the soldiers in the army, 4 brigades now, are becoming increasingly restless and are no longer unwilling to make their concerns public, suggesting that military discipline might be starting, if not exactly to break down, at least to fracture. What on the other side? Well, I got a fascinating report yesterday from an exceptionally well-informed source, and I am very, very grateful to this person, providing me with further information about how the Russians are producing night vision devices in industrial quantities. And this goes beyond the night vision devices that have appeared on the drones. The night vision devices that the Russians are producing are now being produced in industrial quantities and are being distributed right across their military. And again, I'm not going to discuss in detail what this person said to me because that might disclose facts about him. All I would say is that, again, ingenious engineering and industrial solutions, which I suspect for all sorts of reasons, we are probably not capable of making in the West, at least not in Europe. Perhaps in the United States, it might be different. But anyway, fascinating article, bringing home again the extent to which the Russian military, the Russian military-industrial complex is rising to the challenge of this war and is doing so successfully in sector after sector, ensuring that the troops on the front lines are kept supplied with all the weapons and all the ammunition and equipment that they need. And again, just to repeat, the contrast between the way in which the Russians are enlisting men into their army, luring them into the army, or persuading them to join the army as full-time professional soldiers, giving them extensive training, and this chaotic and disastrous mobilization that Ukraine is now hurtling towards. Well, it is painful to see. But to reiterate again, I see neither a military strategy whereby Ukraine can turn this process round, nor a political one. To repeat again, perhaps the best, the most intelligent piece written up to this in this conflict up to now about what Ukraine should do was written, in my opinion, back in August by Jim Webb and George Beebe. They did suggest at that time, whilst the offensive was still underway, that Ukraine might be better advised to abandon the offensive and go onto the defensive. But they also suggested that Ukraine begin substantive negotiations with the Russians. Going onto the defensive now is going to be much more difficult than it would have been in August when Beebe and Webb proposed it. The Ukrainian army has been shattered, and doing so without a political and diplomatic strategy to end the war is only going to buy Ukraine a little time and make the final defeat of Ukraine even more catastrophic, with more thousands of people killed, with the demographic balance in Ukraine perhaps upset beyond retrieval, and with a ghastly and unnecessary waste of human life. But that apparently is where we are, and that is apparently the direction we are heading. We shall see how things turn out. I think there's now a better than even chance that Adveyevka will fall at some point within the next few weeks. But it does look as if the political temperature in Kiev is rising, even as in Russia, in advance of the elections in March, it is becoming ever more confident. On that front, briefly to say, there's been more economic news over the last few days from Russia. It appears to suggest that despite the interest rate increases, economic growth remains strong. And though I think far too much time and effort is devoted to this topic, it also seems that the ruble has been strengthening over the last few weeks, and that might have an eventual effect on domestic inflation. Anyway, leave all that aside. What else has been going on in the world? Well, I saw a furious article by Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton. Bolton and Trump, by the way, have now completely fallen out with each other. Bolton is actively campaigning against Trump. But anyway, that's another story. Anyway, John Bolton, furious about the humanitarian pause that has happened in Gaza, complaining that this is a political victory for Hamas, worried that the pause in Gaza might indeed eventually evolve into a full-scale ceasefire. Further comments by President Biden, which also appeared to hint that converting the humanitarian pause into a ceasefire might indeed be what the administration is now trying to do, will presumably make John Bolton and people like him even more angry. But if that is indeed where we're going, then all I will say is people like Bolton should have thought that this was at least a plausible outcome when they first advocated and pushed the Israelis into that military offensive in Gaza, which has now been paused. Going all the way back to October, I said that I thought it was a big mistake, that the outcome might not turn out well, politically speaking. I'm not in any way disputing that if Israel persists in its campaign in Gaza, then at some point Hamas will be defeated. But I've always said that it's the political constraints that are the problem. Anyway, I wasn't the only person making that point then. You'll find that there were lots of people in Israel, as I've subsequently discovered, who were making that point then also. And it was also made, or at least touched on, by people like Lieutenant Colonel Davis, as the same person that I was mentioning earlier in the program. I in no way set myself up as any kind of expert on Middle East affairs, but it does seem to me that I do occasionally listen to what people who understand the situation in the Middle East and who are familiar with military matters, at least listen to what these experts say. It seems to me that the problem with people like Mr. Bolton is that they don't listen to anybody except themselves. And if outcomes, therefore, invariably follow from what they advocate, which they don't like, well, they should blame themselves, not other people. Anyway, much more about that, much more about the situation in the Middle East in future programs. But suffice to say, as I've said previously, that it does seem to me that we are now, or we could be seeing we could be at an important moment in the war in Ukraine. That's my program. This is my program for today. More from me soon. Let me reiterate again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. The amazing things that you will find there are magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have an excellent day, and thank you for watching this program.